Hi, in today's video, we're going to learn how to memorize the unit circle. There are multiple ways to memorize this unit circle, but this is one of the suggested methods. It's up to you to look for a different one that you feel comfortable with, but again, this is one of the methods. First of all, let's start and say, why do we call it a unit circle? That word unit has a meaning, and what does that mean? So we call it unit circle because it has a radius of 1, which is the unit. So the radius of that circle equals 1. Now, as you see, this circle is divided into quadrants. So let's review together the xy coordinate before we get into the circle. This is the x-axis, this is the y-axis. And this divide the plane into 4 parts that we call quadrant. So this is quadrant 1, this is quadrant 2, this is quadrant 3, and this is quadrant 4. And by convention, we go counterclockwise, if you guys noticed that, to number the quadrants. And this is what we're going to do to work with that circle. We're going to go counterclockwise. So those 4 quadrants determine the xy coordinate and the sign SIGN of those coordinates. So for example, if I give you a point right here, which in this quadrant, the 3, 1, point in that plane, you're going to notice that the x value is positive and the y value both are positive. Apply this and pick a point from any other quadrant and figure out whether the x coordinate is positive or negative, and you're going to get the following results. Both x and y's are negative in the third quadrant. They're both positive in the first quadrant. In the second quadrant, x is negative and y is positive. And in the fourth quadrant, x is positive and y is negative. And this is very important to memorize or to understand actually, because it's going to be applied to our unit circle. What does x and y have to do with our unit circle? So let's look at this. The circle is divided into angles. Imagine you're cutting like a pizza into pieces. You're gonna use the following pattern. You're gonna use a pattern of 30 degrees and you're going to use a pattern of 45 degrees. So here's what we're going to do. In that first quadrant, each quadrant, I'm going to have 3 angles. So the first one is going to be 30. I'm going to skip this one, 30, 60, 90. So that is the pattern of the 30 degrees. And we'll go to the other quadrant in a minute. So 30, 60, 90. And then the same thing, I'm gonna also skip the middle. I'm gonna add 30. This is 120. This is 150, which leads us to the 180, and so on. So add the 30 every time. 210, skip the middle, and 240, which will lead us to 270. And add the 30, that's at 300, 330. So as you notice, I always skip the middle because the middle angle follows another pattern, which is the pattern of 45 degrees. And if we go back to our quadrant, the empty one here, maybe it's a clear view. The angle that divides each quadrant into 2 equal parts is a 45-degree angle. And it makes sense because this is a 90-degree. X-axis and y-axis are perpendicular. They form a 90-degree angle. So what cuts that in the middle would be a 45-degree. So if I go with the 45-degree pattern, add the 45, I get 90. Add the 45 to get to that other middle angle. So that will give us 135. And add another 45, you will land on 180. Add a 45, you will land on this angle, which divides the third quadrant into 2 equal parts, which is 225. Add a 45, you get 270. Add another 45, you get 315. add a 45, you get 360. And of course, we start from 0 degree and end up with a 360 degree, which is a full turn. So this is a suggested way to memorize the degrees. Now, I find it easier to just add 15 to the previous one if I want to get the angle that divides the quadrant into two equal parts. So 120 plus 15, I get this. 210 plus 15, I get that. And 300 plus 15, I get the 315, which again, those are remarkable ones. They divide the quadrant into two equal parts. So this is how we can memorize the degrees. Now you should ask yourself, what does XY have to do with the angles? And here's what we're gonna explain together. I'm gonna make a 90-degree angle right here, going from that point. And when we say 30 degrees, it's the central angle right here. And since we're talking about trig functions, I'm talking about, first of all, the sine and cosine, the mostly or frequently used sine and cosine trig functions. If I'm looking for the cosine of that 30 degree, we learned in the right triangle, the cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. And if you guys notice, and maybe here we should erase a little bit, you always have that final product to your right, so you can see how a filled circle will look like. But we'll use this one just to practice how to memorize all this info that is given on the filled unit circle. So if I look at the definition and say this is a unit circle, so the radius is 1, this is a radius, which is 1, and so on. This is another radius. This is a radius. It's 1. So when I form the right angle triangle, and I know this is the 30-degree central angle, and I'm looking for cosine, I'm looking for the adjacent side. So now we can erase this. I'm looking for the adjacent side, which is this, adjacent, over the hypotenuse. And the hypotenuse is equal in this case. So I'm going to highlight it in a different color. This is the hypotenuse. This is adjacent. This is hypotenuse. And as you notice, the hypotenuse is a radius. And that's why the hypotenuse equals 1. So it's basically A over 1, which is just the adjacent side. And let's look at this. If I had a point right here and I have the coordinates of that point, square root of 3 over 2 and half, this is an x value, this is a y value. This is the blue highlighted one is nothing but the x value of that point. So that is why we say that the cosine is the x and the sine is going to be the y for the same reason, but we will change the color. So the sine of 30 is opposite over hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is still a 1 because it's a radius, so I'm only dealing with the opposite, which is nothing but the y value, and in this case it's half. So the y value of that coordinate. So to sum it up, when we read only in the unit circle, when we read the unit circle, the x value, the x coordinate of a point will represent the cosine of the central angle, and the y value will represent the sine of the angle. And I don't like you to memorize without understanding, and this is why I presented the reason why we say cosine is the x value and sine is the y. So we can generalize and use it from now on that the cosine is going to be the x value and the sine will be the y value of the angle. So let's see how we can memorize those coordinates. We're going to start with, now those angles are so remarkable. I call them just corner angles if you want. This is not like a formal name, but it helps me understand this. I start at 0, I go to 90 degree, then this is a 180, and this is a 270. It goes by 90 again because those angles are 90-degree angles, and every time you are adding a 90-degree, and this is a 360. So other than the corner angles, I would start, the corner angles has a different way to interpret the coordinates. So I go back to the XY coordinate. This point right here, if I'm saying the radius of the circle is 1, then the X value is 1 and the Y value is 0 because it's on the X axis. On the other end of the spectrum, this is a -1 X value and a 0 Y value. This point right here, also, this is a radius. It's the distance between the center and a point on the outside of the circle. The X value is 0, Y value is 1 because this point is on the Y axis and the other point of the spectrum is 0, -1. Those are to be memorized. Very important to understand how we got those values, but also to memorize them. What's in between is very simple to memorize. It's just going to be a 3-2-1 pattern. 3-2-1, 3-2-1. And if you notice, I always started from the point next to the x-axis. I'm going to continue with the 3-2-1, and I'm going to continue with the 3-2-1 pattern. And always start from very close to the x-axis and fill out your 3-2-1. Next to the 3-2-1, I'm going to have a 1-2-3. 1-2-3. And the same way I filled the previous ones, I start from next to the x-axis, 1-2-3, and 1-2-3. Now, there's one more thing to do to get all the coordinates. You're going to place a square root and divide it by 2. Square root divided by 2. Square root divided by 2. And you're going to fill in all of them with the square root over 2, not the corner ones. Square root over 2. And you're going to do the same thing for all of those coordinates. The only thing you need to know that a square root of 1 over 2 is nothing but a half because the square root of 1 is just equals 1. If you know this, then you would ignore placing a square root on the 1 because you understand that square root of 1 is 1. And you keep filling out those square root over 2, square root over 2, square root over 2. I don't need to put a square root on 1 because it's just 1. And now that the similar way we interpreted the sign SIGN of x and y, everything is positive here. So the x is positive, cosine is positive, and sine is positive because x and y are both positive. I go to the third quadrant, both are negative. So I place a negative everywhere. So x is negative, y is negative, which means cosine is negative and sine is negative. And I go right here, x is negative and y is positive, which means the cosine is negative. So I'm only going to place the negative next to the x coordinate. And in the fourth quadrant, the x is positive, y is negative, which means I'm going to place only negative next to the y. In other words, the cosine is positive and the sine is negative. Right here, the cosine is negative and the sine is positive. So that way we memorized the degrees. We looked at the corner angles. We memorized the sign, SIGN, positive, negative, of each coordinate in each quadrant. And we memorized the coordinates. One last thing to memorize is the radian. Now, you can always do conversion where if you have like a degree or all the degrees, you can convert those to radian, but this is very time consuming. You're gonna see we're gonna have to use that circle a lot. So it has to be memorized in a more efficient way. Now, 0 degrees equals 0 radian, definitely. And the 360 degree is the 2 pi, the full turn. The 90 degree, the 180, the 270. Now, we'll deal with those in a minute. Here's the one pattern. Again, remember, two follow the pattern of the 90-degree, and the middle one is separate pattern. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna start with the 30-degree. You need to know it's a pi over 6, and 45 is a pi over 4. And those are the two patterns in that circle. So I'm going to start with 1 pi over 6. And this one is a 2 pi over 6. This one, it's like a flower pattern. So look at this. 1 pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6, 4 pi over 6. Don't forget to skip the middle one. It follows a different pattern. 5 pi over 6, 6 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6, 8 pi over 6, 9 pi over 6, 10, skip the middle one, 11, and 12. The only thing you need to do in this case is go back and simplify. So this is a pi over 6. 2 pi over 6 is pi over 3. 3 pi over 6 is pi over 2. I'm going to put the simplified one right here. 4 pi over 6 is 2 pi over 3. 5 pi over 6 cannot be simplified. 6 pi over 6 is just pi. 7 pi over 6 cannot be simplified. 8 pi over 6, if I divide it by 2, it will be 4 pi over 3. 9 pi over 6 is nothing but 3 pi over 2. Here, 5 pi over 3. And I go back, this remains the same. And I go back and simplify. 12 pi over 6 is the 2 pi. So this is one flower, and I can create another flower with a pi over 4. So here's a 1 pi over 4. This is a 2 pi over 4, which also gives us pi over 2. 3 pi over 4. 4 pi over 4, which gives us just pi. 5 pi over 4. 6 pi over 4, which also gives us 3 pi over 2. 7 pi over 4. And 8 pi over 4, which will gives us the 2 pi. So I know it's a lot, but you'll get used to it. It's a long video, but this is how I memorize my unit circle, and I hope this method is easy for you. Again, there are different ways to memorize the unit circle. You choose the one that you like the most.